Yeah, thank you so very much. Thank you so very much for the offer to chat and discuss these really exciting projects that we have going on. And yes, as you said, Kevin, thank you so much for helping us out at our preserves. We yeah, that Klingel Preserve will feature in this presentation as well. And I also wanted to let you know that Dan Froelich is with us tonight, as well as Kaylee Kaufner, who's collaborating on this project. She's a grad student at Evergreen State College, using this technology for her master's work on Borneo birds. So, yep, there's lots of resources here that if you have any questions, and feel free to stop me during the presentation, or Kevin, if you want to give me a heads up if there's pertinent questions that come up during the talk, that'd be great. Great. So yeah, I'll be spending this photograph here that you see is at Grover's Creek Preserve. It's a stand of trees that include 200-year-old Sitka spruce and the same-aged cedar trees in this peat bog forest. It's called Don Willett calls it the Troll Grove, and I'm going to be spending quite a bit of time on this preserve tonight, in addition to several other preserves. But the reason being, the goal is to not just let you know what's going on, what GPC is doing at across our preserves, but also give you some fair warning about some upcoming projects that are going on at the Grover's Creek Preserve, which include the patch cuts. So this is an attempt to warn everybody before they start freaking out when the chainsaws start going. And the chainsaws are going to start going for ecological purposes to improve forest health. Okay, with that caveat, a little bit about GPC, Great Peninsula Conservancy. We're your local land trust, and we hold lands, we own lands in 3 counties, Kitsap County, Western Pierce, and Northeastern Mason County. And in addition to owning lands in fee, we also hold conservation easements, and as well as assist to purchase properties and donate them or give them to the county to manage, all in the spirit of conservation and preserving these important natural open spaces, forest lands, estuaries, riparian habitats. And to date, we've preserved over 11,000 acres. And so this is just an example of some of these, the sites that we've preserved by county. And I invite you to take a look at our website. There's an interactive map where you can take a look at all these different land holdings. So if you follow this link over here, you can select on the preserves and conservation easements, learn a little bit about them. There's also images. Some of these areas you can learn whether they have public access or not. But yeah, we're your local land trust. So again, I'm going to be focusing primarily on this preserve up here in the northern portion of Kitsap County, which is Grover's Creek. And here's an aerial image of where it is in space, from space, just south of Port Gamble area, just west of Kingston. And the preserve itself is quite varied. You can see can you see my cursor when I put it on here? Yeah, great. The old patch of peat bog forest is basically comprised this area right here. And this is all wet. Grover's Creek runs through here. And just for some perspective, this is North Kitsap Heritage Park right here. This is Miller Bay Road. And this is North Kitsap Heritage Park parking lot off Miller Bay Road. So we're going to be doing, GPC has been doing some conservation practices and will be doing some more, which I'll discuss tonight. And we'll be using birds as a metric to basically track whether our conservation practices, how the birds respond to these practices. And I'll be getting into the depths, the deep of how we go about doing that. The preserve itself is about 270 acres, and it forms, a larger part of 1,700 protected acres in North Kitsap. So just to give you an idea of what type of wildlife it supports, perhaps some of you have seen this, but just south of Grover's Creek proper, and this is the mouth of Miller Bay right here, GPC is about to acquire this property right here called the Tucker Preserve. And let's see if this works. You can access this video on YouTube, but this was taken by one of my colleagues, Claire Voris, of a wonderful incident. And this is just downstream of Grover's Creek. We see lots of bear sign in the preserve itself, but a very healthy, intact system to support animals like these large, charismatic megafauna. All right, let's see if I can get back on track here. All right, so Grover's Creek, for many of GPC's preserves, especially those with forested habitats, one of the first things we do is we build forest management plans. And these enable us to define our goals and objectives for the properties. And the production of the plans also identify the resources that are on the sites. And that helps us guide our management prescriptions. And this depends on, our objectives for the forest. So there was a plan produced for Grover's Creek in 2017, and it identified, one of the first things they do is you go out into the field and you collect information on what the tree stands look like, and you produce a thing called the forest, an assessment of the FMUs, the forest management units. And so these are the two mapping exercises that came about from that, from the FMP, the Forest Management Plan. And each of these FMUs have prescriptions based on what we want to see for these stands, 30 years from now or 50 years from now. And so the practices that we're going to be employing on Grover's Creek and many of these other preserves that we will be following how the birds respond to our practices are driven by these plans. And so this is just an example of what the management plan looks like. And this is one of the appendices that shows you the implementation timetable. So for example, if you go to Forest Management Unit number 1, it says between 2018 and 2023, this is a good time to go in there and do some pre-commercial thinning operations. And these forest management plans are essential for us, for GPC and other organizations, private landowners as well, to go after agency funding for implementing some of these practices. A lot of these practices don't make money. If you want to go and harvest lands, a pre-commercial thin is really, it's costing you money to do that work, but there's agencies out there that can help you fund some of those projects, like the Natural Resource Conservation Service. But you need a forest management plan to do that, so that's what we do for all of our properties. So to transition, what is a healthy forest? Well, I'm probably preaching to the choir here. These are stands that have big trees and a diversity of structure in them. I think this place at Grover's Creek, which does have some healthy forest stands in it, in these old growth areas. Our old executive director, Sandra Staples Bortner, summed it up. She says, "It's a magical place of big trees, bears, beavers that remind us of the Kitsap Peninsula of long ago." And that is really indeed the case. So this is what a healthy forest should look like. You should have large woody debris on the forest floor. You should have big trees. You should have a diversity of age classes within the stand. There should be a mosaic of openings because of large natural disturbances such as wind throw or fire or disease. But if you walk amongst our forests in Kitsap and in much of lowland, the Puget Sound region, those conditions don't exist anymore. And this is really what you find on the landscape, and this is what really comprise much of GPC's lands, are these overstocked stands, these dense Douglas fir monocultures, or recently harvested stands that have young stands of young trees of red alder at very high densities, 400 to 500 trees per acre. And both of these photographs are taken from Grover's Creek. And the photograph on the left, when I look at that, I see fire risk. I see how fire can readily move through that tinder in the understory there. Very little understory. There should be salal, there should be sword fir and all kinds of diversity, but not in these overstocked stands. So what we're doing out there is to try and reduce the number of straws in these patches. And this can also help with climate resiliency as well. When we have these drier, hotter summers, well, when you have so many straws taking out a limited amount of water, what could happen is you could have all the trees die. But if you thin it down to maybe 140 to 180 trees per acre, you're giving those trees a little bit, at least the ones that remain standing, the healthier ones that we leave standing, a greater chance to survive. So yeah, these are some of the prescriptions that we will be employing in these thinning stands, and looking to see how these birds respond to some of these activities. So here's a map of Grover's Creek and some of the treatment areas where we're going to be implementing some of our actions. The arrows point to the thinning units, and then the cross-hatched areas are these patch cut units. These are around 2 to 3 acres stands of what is otherwise monoculture stands of Douglas fir or the alders. And we're going to be opening up some of those stands to create some structural diversity in the landscape. And then throughout this area too, we're also going to be putting some other wildlife features on the landscape through a technique called girdling, which is creating standing trees. And we basically cut the cambium of the trunk to leave let the tree die, but stand in place so it could provide habitat for wildlife. All right, and we are working with a wonderful organization called the Northwest Natural Resource Group, and they are helping us with obtaining the forest practices application, or producing the forest practices application, which is a requirement to harvest and sell any timber in Washington. And we selected them because they practice ecological forestry, and this is they implement forestry practices for the purpose of managing these forests for health and for forest complexity. And we've also conveyed to them how we want to generate some revenue to offset the costs for these thinning operations and these gap openings. And the revenue generated can help us with invasive species control, replanting, as well as road maintenance. So that money generated will be put back into the GPC program. And NNRG is well known in the field for using novel silvicultural tools to manipulate stand densities and species composition to create canopy gaps through a variety of techniques. And we will be also just dropping some trees in place rather than carting all of them off and selling them. And again, the goal is to create these climate resilient forests with old growth characteristics. And here are some of the, below are some of the tools, releasing dominant trees or the goals. You practice spatially variable thinning and creating some snags as well in the landscape, and also the non-dominant conifers. So to alert the public about what we're doing, we have had some on-site field tours to convey the intent of our management activities. This is Jarl Mann with the field vest. He's the lead forester with NNRG. That's Dan Froelich to the right of him behind the tree here. But yeah, the idea was to take people out into the land, show them what we're doing. And a lot of the questions that came up during this field tour was, how do you select your trees? Why that one and not this one? And so Jarl was out there and said, well, this is not merchantable, or this one will release this tree that's next to it, or this one has a dead top and we are going to leave it stand. So it was very informative for the public to see what is done on the ground. And again, you can see how sparse the understory is there at this stand that we're going to be thinning. And this stand will be reduced from about 500 trees per acre to about 180. So the current status of our forest practices application is we submitted it. We have a site visit with DNR next week. They're going to be there. There's also some representation from the Suquamish tribe that will be looking at our wetland boundaries to make sure that we've acknowledged those appropriately and have setbacks appropriate. And then the next step is for NNRG to select a logger. They have lots of experience with that. And before they start taking trees down, we will be talking to them about our prescription, making sure that they leave the important conifers like cedars and just take the trees that are identified to be thinned out in these thinning units as well as the patch cuts. Our start date is early to mid-January, depending on how well our field visit goes next week and making sure that we have all our I's dotted and T's crossed. So I mentioned how having a forest management plan allows you to seek funding through organizations or agencies like the Natural Resource Conservation Service. Well, they have a program called the Conservation Stewardship Program, and we have a contract with them for the next 5 years to create these patch cuts on Grover's Creek, as well as these snags and these wildlife features on not just Grover's Creek, but 7 other preserves that GPC own. And when I started with GPC in 2021, I was handed this project, the contractor was in place, and my charge was to go out there onto the landscape and start creating these snags and creating these wildlife features. And I think one of the things that I've always considered about land trusts is all too often we get these pieces of land, we set them aside, and we just kind of let them go. We do what we need to do to manage them, but we really don't understand how our actions, whether they're working or whether we're achieving our objectives. So this is when I collaborated with Dan Froelich and with Dr. Alison Styring at Evergreen State College to see what things we could do, to what metric we could find to understand how the effects of these forest conservation practices. And I have a background in birds, and they're an easy bird to record. They respond readily to habitat manipulations, and so this is how birds came into the play of things. And going back to the conservation stewardship program, use this opportunity, the available funding, to put the actions on the ground, but use the birds as a metric to gauge how things would go. So I'll get into the details of the birds shortly, but I'm just going to continue a little bit more about what each of these techniques employ, what happens in the patch cuts. Well, the intent of these patch cuts is to mimic these natural disturbance regimes, such as wind throw or fire or disease. And as I showed in those previous slides, many of our stands are even aged, very little diversity. So creating, manipulating these stands by dropping some trees, pulling some out if they're merchantable, so we can pay for some of these activities, but also leaving a lot of materials on the ground is the intent for these patch cuts. 3 acres was the size that was given to me. I think that's a little bit large. We've reduced the size of many of them just because of their proximity to wetland buffers and riparian buffers. And I'll show what that looks like on the landscape in just a bit. So the second component to create wildlife features is these snags and dentries and coarse woody debris. And here's a photograph of my colleague, Ben Weimer, creating a standing snag. And the only living part of a tree's trunk is just beneath the bark or the cambium layer. And if you girdle the tree, if you basically sever the phloem and xylem cells, you will kill the tree. And it will remain standing. And that's the idea, is to create standing snags that will rot out eventually, and that would create hosts for primary cavity nesters that will drill holes into the tree, and then you could have secondary cavity nesters come in there that don't excavate their own cavities. But that's really essentially the technique that we employed. We used either chainsaws with thick barked trees, or we used chisels and hand saws, and it's actually quite exhilarating and satisfying when the sap is running in the spring, and this particularly with alders, and you cut 2 rings around the bowl, and then with a chisel you can really just peel back that bark to girdle the tree. So that's one technique. And then the other goal was to create these habitat features called habitat piles and constructed logs. And those are the photographs on the right and the left, the right top and right bottom. The constructed log measures about 20 feet in length and is about 20 inches in diameter. And so you could either lay a tree down to meet that goal, or you could pile up some logs. And basically you're trying to mimic these old growth characteristics. And lots of wildlife use these resources, as you surely know. The habitat piles similarly, these are constructed by putting large debris or larger logs in the bottom, and then as you get up to about 6 feet in height, your materials thin out. Easy to do once you've immediately after you've thinned a stand, but more difficult to do when you're trying to find these materials in a forest that has been cleared out historically. So, but we had a prescription by NRCS to achieve a certain number of snags per acre and a certain number of habitat piles and coarse woody debris per acre. And we've worked feverishly over the last year and a half or so to start this work on several of our preserves. So this is what we've done to date. We've girdled over 400 trees, and the size classes, these are in inches, 6 to 10 inches, 10 to 20, and then greater than 20. And you can see the disparity between the size classes that we actually girdled on the properties. There just aren't that many trees greater than 20 inches out there on our preserves. So that's a function of that. And then one of the things we were urged to do through the prescription that NRCS gave us was to make sure that we girdled a number of species, the diversity of species. And the reason being, conifers are going to stand longer than deciduous trees. It was difficult. I have to say, my kid's name is Cedar, and it was difficult to girdle a cedar tree out there, but we did it anyway, knowing that in the long term that these features would stand longer than in the deciduous trees like red alder and big leaf maple. But that's the spread of how that worked out. And the number of red alder and big leaf maple, again, is a function of what is out there on the landscape. There's just more of those early seral species on our lands. And the photographs just show you some of the techniques that we employed for some of the larger trees, like the center photograph, that's a Douglas fir. You just can't chisel out a gap. So you do 2 rings chain wide around the tree and hoping that you get through that cambium. Yeah, so I'll just give you a rundown of where these places are in space where we've done the work. So here we are in North Kitsap area. This preserve is called Eglon Beebe Preserve. It's west of Port Gamble, south of Hansville. And in this preserve, those dots relate to, and I don't know if you can see the symbology in there, but each of those refer to the size class and the species. And this just is a way of us being able to track what we've done out there. And the goal was to really distribute the trees, the snags, across the landscape. Proximity to creeks is important, especially with habitat piles. They're much more valuable to wildlife seeking refuge when they're closer to water bodies. We didn't put too many in that area just because of the steepness of that slope, and operating chainsaws safely on slopes was one of our criteria for tree selection out there. But yeah, I'll just go through a series of these just to see what was done on the landscape and how these features were spread across our project sites. This Eglon Beebe is 20 acres, and we girdled over 100 trees in this preserve. This is Martha John Creek, and that's where it is in space. This treatment area was about 16 acres or so, and we girdled mostly in the 10 to 20 dBH range. And again, that was a function of what was out there. But there were some bigger trees up in the northern portion of this, and we were able to get a fair number of large trees girdled in this preserve. And the third site is Daniels Creek Preserve. This is where it is in space south of Paulsbo. And this stand is a wet, kind of a flooded, older forest. And not very many big trees left in this. This was harvested within the last 50 years or so, and definitely older dominated. And you can see how the spread of DBH classes worked out there in this effort. So back to Grover's Creek. We will be creating some snag features on this landscape, but that work won't be implemented until 2023. That's our contract with NRCS. But we will be opening up the patch cuts, and this map right here is a forest practices activity map that was submitted as part of our forest practices application, where we provide DNR with information about where the water courses are, where the wetlands are, and how we established our buffers. And this map captures that. And those 6 polygons there, the ones with the green dots in there, those are our patch cuts. And the green dots are our leave trees. Those are the trees that will be our seed trees for the next generation, that will provide seed material for once those areas are opened up. The 2 units over here, this one right here, it's 8 acres or so, and this one up here is 4 acres. Those are the 2 thinning units, where we will be reducing just the number of trees down to 180 trees per acre. And that's where Grover's Creek is located. So in the next month or 2, there'll be trucks moving in and out. We'll be dropping some of the trees in place. But we will be harvesting some of the trees out of these blocks, these units, and selling them if they're merchantable. The one other forest management action that we have been working on is reforesting some of our preserves. And this is the preserve that Kevin mentioned in the vicinity of Belfair down here in Mason County. And when I was given this project, we had some funding from a foundation to spend $25,000 on plants and mulch and topsoil and things like that. And I thought, what a great opportunity to implement a research project. So what you're seeing on this map here on the left-hand side, these circles are our bird monitoring plots that occur within our planting zones. And I'll return to this in a little bit later. But when we took this on as a project, I thought a great opportunity to collaborate on this novel approach to dealing with our hot, drier summers that we're getting up here in the Pacific Northwest, really everywhere. And there's a strategy called assisted migration, which is aimed at bringing in materials from more southern seed zones which are believed to be able to better withstand these hotter, drier climates that we're experiencing here. I'm sure you all remember the heat dome we had that we had. So this is Dr. Janice Bauman on the left-hand side, with some plant materials that were delivered from, I believe this shipment came from Oregon. And this is Kayleen, oh man, I'm blanking on her name. This is terrible. This is her grad student, Chelsea Harris, at Western Washington University, who took this project on, this assisted migration project, for her master's work. And the idea was, we used a series of tools to figure out where to get our genetic stock. But the goal was to reforest this area. It's a transition zone between an estuary at the southern end of Hood Canal, or right by the mouth of Union River. and you transition from estuary to uplands. And these are the upland planting areas right here. And so I thought, what a great opportunity to figure out whether we can drive future restoration actions with a research study or with some research. And so through this collaboration, we worked with nurseries down in California and Oregon, and we used this a tool called the seed lot selection tool, which enables you to identify your target site and what your target site might look like in 30 years from now, based on certain climate variables. So we used this tool, and it pumped out this a spatially explicit map of where appropriate source material would be for these tree species that we were looking for. And we started small. We spoke with a couple of forest pathologists and some environmental, some assisted migration ethics professors about how to go about doing this. My concern was introducing novel pathogens into our preserves and what that could do. We picked 3 species: Douglas fir, shore pine, and Gary oak. And we obtained materials from California, Oregon, and then also locally in Washington. And Chelsea set up these study grids to plant these in 3 study plots. Sorry, 4 study plots. And in between the plantings, we also put in some shrubs as well, so it didn't look like a tree farm. And then we also put in some other additional conifer species and deciduous species like the big leaf maple, spruce, and madrone. But all in all, this is what the design looked like. And we planted this out in January 2022, so earlier this year. These are the study plots. And within these study plots, we have put in these remote acoustic monitoring devices that I'll be touching on in just a bit to study how the birds respond to this technique. So just taking the advantage of a reforestation effort, tapping into Western Washington University, and then using the bird devices to better understand how and drive future restoration work. This is what the site looks like now. These are the planting holes. All the plants have been placed in there. This is one of the study plots right here. And the other 3 study plots are over here. But all in all, 5,000 plants were placed in the area. All right. So we received funding from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. They have a program that supports land trusts, and the program is called the Land Trust Bird Conservation Initiative. And collaborating with Dan Froelich and Dr. Styring and NNRG and Kaylee, we applied, we wrote up a proposal with our intent to use these devices to collect baseline data, what the conditions were before we implemented the practices, and then after the practices. And with these data, or with these acoustic monitoring devices, you could record these 10 years later using the same locations, and really can look at the trajectory of how the birds change and respond. The great thing about these devices is they're super small, they're relatively inexpensive, and relatively easy to use. Another component of this, which I'll touch on more in just a little bit, is comparing the use of these devices with existing or traditional methods like point counts and area searches. Cornell was really interested in that component. So these are our study sites for that Cornell funded us for. And several you have seen already. Here's Grover's Creek, where we'll be putting the patch cuts and the thinning. This is Eglon BB up here in northern Kitsap. This is the Klingel Bryan Beard. This is the restoration, the tree reforestation program. And then on the southern tip of the Key Peninsula down here is a preserve that GPC owned called the Johnson South Sound Preserve. And there's 14 acres of tree treatment area where we will be creating snags and coarse woody debris on that preserve. And then here along the 16 highway is the Burley Wilson Preserve. So these are our 5 studies, our study sites. At Grover's Creek, this is what our sampling regime looks like. The preserve boundary is in red. The patch cuts are in white. The thinning units are crosshatched. And then our bird sampling plots are in circles. And the orange circles are our control plots. And our treatments are the greens. And each of these is about 75 meters in radius, each of these study plots. And we deployed units, actually just the other day, just yesterday, Dan went out and deployed these units in each of these plots. So the sampling schedule and the timeline for this work extends, at least for the funding from Cornell. It's a 1-year funded project, and it extended from the summer of 2022 through the spring of 2023. We've conducted our pre-conservation practice sampling that was done in July. We were only issued the funds in June, and we deployed the moths and started collecting the information or recording acoustic data in June and July. And then we implemented the habitat conservation practices that I showed, the snags and the patch cuts. The patch cuts should be created hopefully in January and February. And then coming up in the spring of 23, we will be running our devices again to collect the post-conservation practices. And because there was a little bit of a delay in getting the forest practices application in due to a variety of reasons, we will, but luckily we are having an opportunity to collect some winter data as well, which will be done in the next couple of weeks. And then following that, we will be analyzing the sound data and then comparing it with our ground truthing data, which I'll touch base in just a little bit as well. So this is what the device looks like in the hand. It's small. It needs to be protected by a case, and you can buy the case for about $40. These devices are produced from a factory in Germany. Give yourselves lots of time to receive them because of chip shortages that delayed delivery several weeks. But you can also build the cases out of just electrical boxes. Dr. Alison Staring has done that on a number of her projects. And then the image on the left is the interface with the device and the computer, and how you can program these devices to record certain intervals or periods, recording periods. And so what we did is We recorded the morning song. So during the summer, 5:30 to 9:30, we had 4 hours of recording. And then we had a late afternoon, 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock. And then we also had an evening session to see if we could capture owls, some of the owl that might occur on the preserves. And so this is all done before before you deploy the moths. We found that the devices can record data depending on how frequently you want information recorded. They can record data for up to 2 weeks out there. And it also depends on the SIM card that you use, the little data card, the SD micro card. 64 gigabytes is what seems to serve our purposes the best. So we configured all the moths, and then we'd go out into our project sites, and in the center of our centroids, we'd affix the devices to a prominent tree, if we had a tree available. So the image on the left, the moth is attached in its case, and it's facing away from a street if there is a road there, because it does pick up really any noise that is generated within the vicinity. And then at the Klingel site, we put it on the ground on a stake. That's the image on the right, or on some low shrubs to keep it off the ground. But that's what the deployment looked like. And here, this is a close-up of what the Eglon BB preserve looks like. The preserve is in the light green box here. It's 20 acres, and these are our sampling units. The centroids are where the moths were placed. And while one of the components that I mentioned earlier is how the importance of verifying whether the information from these acoustic monitoring devices, whether they were accurate and how they compare to our traditional methods. And so one of the things that we did while these moths were playing is to go out to these centroids and collect these traditional point count and area search methods. And here's an example of Dan in the field with the moth over there in the purple that's attached to a tree. And this is a copy or an example of one of our area search data sheets, which was conducted while these moths were running. And this is just a way of just comparing and validating what we are able to capture using our traditional methods versus what these AudioMoths are capturing. One other thing that we added as well is the Cornell Lab have this software called Merlin, where when you run the app, you could use a sound ID to identify what birds are out there. And for several of these plots, we ran Merlin while the AudioMoths were running and while we were collecting these traditional point count and area search data, as an additional comparison to see what Merlin is able to capture compared to these other methods. So yeah, we did these at all of our treatment as well as our control plots at all of our 5 sampling locations. There were 15 sampling stations. And yeah, we're in the process of reducing the data, starting to look at it. I have a really, please don't screenshot this and do anything with it, because this is really raw, just species numbers. It hasn't been validated or anything like that, but it just shows you what the type of numbers of species that we've been getting by survey method across our 5 treatment areas or our preserves. Burley Creek, the point counts are in the red, the area searches are blue, and on the x-axis here is our control plots versus our treatment plots. Similarly at Eglon, these are controls, treatments, and et cetera, et cetera. So what we will add once we start reducing and going through our information from the AudioMoth data is we'll be able to plot the number of species that these moths are picking up and be able to compare them. So how do you get the information off the moths? Well, there's this freeware, this software called Arbamon, and it's compatible with these AudioMoth devices. And it's a very powerful, sophisticated program that enables us to conduct analyses on large volumes of data. And it's a flexible analytical tool that can help us answer specific research questions. So, and Kaylee can speak to this because she's doing this for her master's work in Borneo. But essentially what we're doing is for each, what the software allows you to do is identify where your study plots are. And then for each of your study plots, you download your recordings. You download your recordings from the AudioMoths into this into the software. And so, for example, you could see right here, these are the number of recordings for the treatment plot, the eastern treatment plot at Eglon BB Preserve. To date, we've downloaded 10,000 files. And think how painstakingly slow it would be to go through each one of these audio files and figure out what's there. So the beauty of this software is that it enables you to build templates. So, for example, this is an example of a 1-minute section of one of those audio files. And this sonogram right here is the pattern for the Pacific wren. And similarly, right here is the sweet song of the flycatcher, the Pacific slope flycatcher. And so what we're doing right now, and we're also soliciting the help of a UW capstone student to help us mine through these loads of thousands of files to reduce the information and figure out what we have out there in terms of species composition at each of these study plots. And so what we do is we build a template. We create a template from this signature right here. You save that template, and then you tell the program, okay, use this signature and run it against the 30,000 other files, 1-minute files, and produce, and what it'll do is produce a CSV file or a spreadsheet of where that signature is found. It's a really super effective and efficient way of mining data, acoustic data. We've identified about 54 species that could benefit from our practices. Many of them are cavity-dependent species, but some are low understory herbivore insectivores, such as McGilvery's warbler. And so we will be doing this for them too. And if they don't show up in any of our sound files, well, then we can use that information to say, well, we don't have enough of that resource in our preserves. It can help us drive our management actions. Similarly, if we don't get any cavity nesting species in some of our treatment areas, that's an indicator to us, well, perhaps we don't have enough snags on the landscape. So this is just a really wonderful tool to use birds to help us drive our management actions. And Yeah, and so the next step is starting to get into this data. Kaylee is helping us out with that that process, and as we're collecting more information, we will continue to add these files to the Arbomon software. Right now, we're using it in-house, just with the folks that we want to collaborate with, but this software does allow you to make this information public, and you can give this information to other folks to use as a resource, or if there's any research questions that other researchers are interested in, the software does allow you to make that available as well. So that is what I have right now for the presentation. Happy to answer questions. And again, Kaylee's on, I think she's still here, and Dan is still here. Please ask questions, and happy to go back in the slide presentation and yeah, answer any questions.
All right, well, thanks a lot, Adrian. That was definitely a very interesting presentation. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put those in the chat, or you could raise your hand or come off, put your camera on and ask your questions directly. While folks are thinking about questions, maybe I'll start off with one, Adrian. So you showed a couple photos early on in the presentation where you were making those two strips around each of the trees to make those standing snags. So why were you doing two rings? Why not just one big ring, or you know, what's the purpose of two? Is that to maximize the destruction, I guess, of that tree, or what?
It is. It's to ensure that your tree will, you know, will succumb. And that's what we were told at the outset by our contact at NRCS when they took us out in the field and say, this is the procedure that you should follow. I mean, the best thing too is to create like a 4-inch gap between your cuts, but with these thick barked trees like Douglas fir and hemlock, it's time intensive. So the two-stranded kill technique was what we were told, and these trees can take years to die, so it'll be interesting to see you know, how effective our technique is.
Great. So we had Daniel said, wow, what a great video. That was definitely impressive to see the mother bear snatch that salmon for young. And then Karen said it was great to hear about the local projects and the acoustic study. It hopes to hear about the results in the future. Mary is asking, if you only had the grant from Cornell for 1 year, how will you check the results at year 5 and 10 to get relevant information? Very exciting stuff.
No, that's a good question. And the wonderful thing about this technique and this really easy, cheap tool is we can deploy it. We own the device. So in 10 years, we can go out again. And one of our goals, or one of our requirements as a land trust, is to visit each one of our preserves at least once a year. And so we could, when we go out to visit our preserve, we can go out and deploy these units and keep collecting data. And once we have these templates built for the software, we could run the analysis at any time for the next 10 years, 20 years, you know, as the forest ages and the snags start to develop and the cavities start to get greater. Yeah, no, it offers great opportunity for long-term monitoring at a relatively cheap and efficient way.
Here, I can chime in for a second too. But yeah, the funding in the future, because I mean, one could ask for funding to do this kind of thing every year, but that's a little bit overkill. We don't really need to do it every year, especially because the impacts kind of accumulate over several years of like Adrian was saying about plants dying, but also several years of bird reproduction. So we expect things to change, and we don't need to check it every year, but every few years, better to do it once now, get the baseline, and then see what kind of pots we can tap into later. Maybe there'll be state grants, or the Cornell Lab might want to follow up, and or Kitsap Audubon has its annual pot of revenue from its grants, from the grant, and so that would, who knows what we'll be looking at in 5 years. But whoever's here able to do that, that'll be the kind of question. It'll be a baseline data set that'll be really interesting to follow up on. And the other question there that I wanted to respond to was Judy's. As you learn from these projects, do you see it applying to other locations like the heritage parks? Well, I was kind of surprised that because we rapidly put this this proposal together, and so we were really excited to get the call back from Cornell. And so when they interviewed us, I asked them what they saw in this project, and you'll see the use of moths just being described all over the place. People are using these acoustic recorders for all kinds of different things. And so the representative from Cornell, she said what she really liked was the comparative approach, looking at traditional ways of evaluating bird populations, kind of the birding approach, the point counts and the area searches. I mean, area searches really are a kind of glorified birding. And so she was really excited to see that approach paired with these modern versions, because few people are doing it in that kind of, with the ambition to provide that kind of comparison. And so once we know what the deficits are of maybe the cheaper technique, then people can deploy them knowing that they'd be missing certain things, or programming them to record for particular species, just to be clear about what the data mean that they are collecting by time of day or location, that kind of thing. So yeah, I can imagine using these kinds of recorders. Any Audubon society could deploy a few of these to figure out more about some of the species of interest in their area, where dippers are nesting, or where grouse are booming in the spring, or that kind of thing. So there's lots of potential to deploy these things in other kinds of contexts as well.
Are you sharing the data with Cornell?
Yeah, one of the stipulations was that we eBird all the results as we go along, so they're already on eBird. Yeah, and they'll be. I mean, there's a lot of data coming out, so it'll be complicated to provide all of it in public forums. But the idea is to make this kind of stuff publicly available, for example, through eBird. Just because they were interested in that, because that's an Cornell project too, as you know.
So in the future, once it's all been processed, we should be able to go into eBird and see what kind of reports we're getting from this area.
Yeah, so on eBird, you would just get the bird lists, and I wouldn't provide distinct bird lists from every technique, but for when I finish each count, I put that on eBird already. I just haven't unified the naming process because they're my own, because they're they're not public hotspots. They're just the spots associated with the particular areas we're processing. But yeah, those will be if you look for species, if you do the species searches on eBird, they come up as on there already. Yeah.
So Joe, it looked like put your camera on. Did you have a question?
I do, for Adrian. So could you talk a little bit about the metrics for creating snags? You know, what are the baselines that you use? How did you determine what target numbers you wanted to go for in relation to the different types of forest stands, whether they're, dug for monoculture or, what different ages. You want to kind of explain your choices there?
Yeah, happy to talk about that. Those prescriptions were given to us from the Natural Resource Conservation Service through their CSP program, through their Conservation Stewardship program. And those prescriptions were given based on the forest management plans that were built for each of those preserves. And so the goal was, for each of those preserves, the goal was to have a certain number of snags per acre. And if you didn't have that, then you would try and meet that number by manually creating them. And so our target for most of our preserves was about 2 snags per acre within each of those DBH, the 3 DBH classes, the 6 to 10, the 10 to 20, and then the greater than 20. So really six trees, 6 snags per acre. Some of our stands already had quite a few snags already there. And one of the risks about creating too much death is you get these pockets that could be subject to to pathogens moving in. So in areas where there were sufficient numbers of snags, we didn't create any more there. Does that answer your question, Joe?
So did it, that number didn't vary according to the type of landscape or number of trees per acre that you were working with?
The prescription was given to us for those particular FMUs, for those particular forest management units. So they were applied to those units because of the stand composition and the age of those stands. Yeah, so those maps that were given to us from CSP or from NRCS took into account what was on the landscape already and said, based on the forest management plan description of this stand, this FMU is in need of more snags, and this is what you should target for those locations.
So in your conversation, do you think this 6 per acre of different sizes is conservative or liberal compared to where you're trying to get in terms of a good wildlife habitat?
That's a great question. I think it's a minimum.
Okay.
And one of the issues is that these stands that we're working in are heavily dominated by deciduous trees, which aren't going to stand that long. So having more coniferous representation within those stands as snags is going to be a little bit more long-lived. So I would, yeah, it's tough. It looks like Don wants to say something there, perhaps.
Yes, pose a question. So the Kirk Hansen shows a technique of bundling logs together to mimic, I believe, old growth fallen timber. I didn't catch the term that you used, but the question is, the pictures I've seen of and drawings from Kirk are large. I think he sometimes puts in stakes and has, it looks like maybe 4 feet high or more. But I thought you were talking about a smaller diameter of a bundle of logs. Can you just say a little bit more about what the two things? One is, what is the habitat effect? I thought that the focus was more on sequestering carbon. But what is is there an optimum?
What you're speaking to, I think, is the constructed logs with the staking on either side in order to maintain those logs in place. Yeah, the constructed logs, at least the prescription we were given, is 20 feet long and at least 20 inches in diameter with the accumulated number of logs piled on top of each other. The habitat piles are different. Those are 10 foot by 10 foot and 6 foot high.
So
And-
say just a little bit more about the, I'm surprised how the 20 inches doesn't feel like a very large diameter to me. But anyway, say a little bit more about the purpose. What is the purpose of having those as to mimic large fallen logs? How does that affect habitat?
It creates wildlife features, refuge. The habitat piles creates refuges for wildlife to find cover. And we were doing 1 habitat pile per acre. And again, that's 10 by 10, 6 foot high with large logs at the base and scaling up to finer materials. So you'd have small mammals finding refuge in the base of those those features, and then potentially bird nesting habitat at the tops of the piles. And then the constructed logs, again, also supposed to, both features are supposed to mimic these features in older late seral stands that are provided by coarse woody debris on the forest floor. And 20 inches is what we were told as a minimum for those constructed logs. 20 feet, 20 inches.
So I don't want to take up more time, but the part that I'm missing is what critters benefit from the 2 different techniques.
It's a great question. We need an herpetologist to come out there and start sampling amphibians and reptiles. And putting, one thing we have been discussing, we do have some wildlife cams and putting them out there to see, what type of what type of habitat is being provided by these features. Yeah, I would assume that many creatures are going to be, once these logs start rotting out, you're going to have salamanders, you're going to have all kinds of microbes that are going to occupy there. And just like this slide over here, my question slide, I love this quote that dead logs are far more living than live ones. It's true. You break apart a log and you see all kinds of things that are living in there that supports, higher trophic levels as well.
Let me just chime in here. The group that GPC is working with, the Natural Resource Group, and Y'all, the forester, they are basing their decisions or their recommendations on a body of work that they know more about. They have some information programs and are more public information and are able to speak to some of these issues. And I think y'all would be able to answer some of those questions directly if you can get in on a program that they're running. They're based, Adrian, where are they based? They're based in Jefferson County, and they do public speaking, public events out there and in Kitsap as well. Is that right? You're on mute, Adrian. You're on mute.
I am on mute. Okay. I know Kirk Hansen is based here in Olympia, or at least his family farm is in Bukoda. But they host a variety of events and opportunities to learn more about forest practices and implementing ecologically sustainable forest practices through their fireside chats. If you go online, look up Northwest Natural Resources Group, and I believe they have a blog as well, and you can tap into to see what they have going on. Y'all is doing a super interesting study right now with snow retention in patch cuts, to see whether opening up the canopy can retain snow, snow longer on the ground, and they're finding that is indeed the case if it's intercepted by leaves. They're doing a whole lot of really interesting stuff, and Kirk is dedicated to helping small family farms as well as larger forest owners manage their lands.
I appreciate your going into the depth. We were going to talk to try to reach Kurt tomorrow to talk about our 15 acres in Fort Townsend that has very old trees, but also the Port Gamble Forest Heritage Park, part of the purchase of timber rights includes about a mile along the Sound to Olympics Trail, but 300 feet on each side. So there's an opportunity in our publicly owned park to do some similar research, some aspects of what you're describing. So it's pretty exciting to us to envision the possibilities.
Well, it looks like Kevin had a question in the chat here about several periods of data in regards to the method of observation. Can you get an idea yet on how well the point count versus the AudioMoth versus Merlin ID from those, are they matching up?
Yeah, so I thought I'd respond to that. I saw that on the chat, and that's a good question because it's actually unusual to do a AudioMoth study in winter. But this ties into the kind of the ornithology research that I'm interested in any case, and so I wanted to make sure that this was part of it, and that is life cycle monitoring. So when we think about monitoring what uses an area, we're often we end up kind of arbitrarily choosing, oh, we're looking at breeding season or we're looking at wintering ducks. But it turns out that for every bird, they spend the winter somewhere and they spend the summer somewhere. And it's important to know what, if we're working on habitat conservation, what's going on for any of the birds that are using the area over the whole year, because it's site-based. Turns out that the lowlands of the Pacific Northwest are probably a more important site for wintering birds. If you look at this spring, I'm doing a talk. I've just organized that with Vic Ulsh. In May, I'm doing the monthly presentation, and I'll be talking about this. The Partners in Flight suggest that our monitoring and awareness of bird populations in the Pacific Northwest lowlands is worse for wintering birds, even though so many birds use this area in winter, than it is for summering birds. In other words, our monitoring is a little bit better for summering birds. And so I wanted to be sure to include a winter component in this sampling strategy, because a lot of the, and now we get back to the technology question or the methodology question, Kevin, that you were posing. And that is, so is using moths and the algorithms to find and the templates to find what's in a site, is that equally good throughout the year? Well, I can't give you an answer. Your question is posed as a do we know anything yet? Can we report on anything? And since I just put out the moths for the winter part yesterday, I don't have any data yet that I can tell you about, but it is my impression, using Merlin for the last year and having done point counts for decades, that there are particular benefits and deficits of using each kind of technique at different times of the year. So I suspect that the moth will be quite good at and maybe even better than the time-limited point counts, because you're sampling a longer period during the breeding season when birds are likely to be vocal because there's a motivation for them to be territorial. And so I suspect that sending a person out there for short point counts and even doing area searches where you're disturbing them a little bit and getting the response that way, that those won't be better than, that those traditional methods won't be better than using moths. But I think during the winter, it's a very stochastic process, because it depends. The birds around here just only seem to respond when something disturbs them, when something comes up, and so even a longer sampling might not sample a period when a Cooper's hawk passes by or that kind of thing. But when we walk through on a area search, we are able to draw out a number of the resident birds that might be otherwise quite unobtrusive. You think of different parts of the day, it's not like the birds disappear, it's just they're not very active or vocal during times of the day in the winter. And so, yeah, I have my suppositions, and I'm really excited to figure out how the sensitivity varies between the methods and in particular between the seasons. So I think that'll be an interesting component of the results that we get. But that was intentional, that we have some winter sampling, because this area is so important for winter birds, and that's often not acknowledged in these kinds of studies, and B, because the sensitivity might vary based on the behavior propensities of the birds involved. Anyway, good question.
All right, well, any other questions that you might have? If you want to go ahead and put them in the chat or raise your hand. Looks like Joe, you have one.
I think Judy had her hand up there before me, or Don.
Might be a legacy hand. Judy, is that a legacy hand?
It's a legacy hand.
Yeah, I just wanted, tip of the hat to GPC for doing this. As a park steward, I know that more than one park, Port Gamble and North Kitsap Heritage Parks have talked for quite a while about how we can do wildlife monitoring, amphibians, small mammal trapping, trail cam trapping, the AudioMoth, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to use your work to help expand that work in the parks. And in particular, I wanted to mention the Parks Recreation and Open Space Plan. That's being updated over the next couple of years along with the comp plan. And the PROS plan, as it's called, has got language that says, one of the jobs is to protect wildlife and habitat in the parks, as well as allow human usage and human visits. And I'm hoping we can expand that to include monitoring, so that the Parks Department and the county will have some feedback on how they're doing in terms of the mandate to preserve wildlife and habitat. So this is a real important initiative you're doing, and hats off to you.
Thanks, Joe. And yeah, that was another one of the Cornell's interest and request, was to pass this information off to other land trusts, to other practitioners, and share our lessons learned with them, whether this is an effective and useful technique. So that's, reaching out to you guys, reaching out to GPC attends these land trust meetings, and I presented over there too. So sharing this information, and we need to get our data together to make some sense of it. That's upcoming.
Adrian, let me just chime in there. I've worked with, I've been exposed to land trusts in a number of different places in the country, and it is not, Joe is quite right to call it out, because it is not normal. And I asked Nate in particular when we first launched on this process, and when you said you were going to do some bird stuff, I asked Nate how it is that this is a land trust where that's happening. And just to be clear, I want to pass that on to the Audubon community here, that he said, no, it's a very conscious and intentional effort on his part. He as the manager of as the ED of GPC, he's got to get certain things done, but he's looking for any opportunity actively to encourage his staff and the whole program to find ways to leverage what they're doing, in order to ask these kind of broader or more applicable questions to the about the organisms that live on these sites. So just to underline what you're saying, Adrian, and to answer the question that one reason this is happening is because we've got a land trust with an ED that's very consciously and intentionally making it possible for these additional projects to happen.
Absolutely. And Nate is a big birder as well.
Yeah, well, that might be why this is the thing that launched. But I do just to point out, just to elaborate on Joe's question, you're quite right, Joe, that the moths could be suitable for all kinds of other monitoring. If you think of the sound background provided by, just like you said, amphibians. I mean, for certain amphibians, for frogs, it certainly would be usable. And in fact, one of the sources for environmental sounds, especially for birds, is called Xenocanto, has just expanded its holdings to include orthopterans, so crickets and grasshoppers. And so I mean, we're not a big area for those organisms, but I grew up in New Jersey, and you know, starting in late June, early July, there was just this cacophony at night of crickets and grasshoppers. And it's great that people are now developing the resources to be able to monitor that kind of stuff that we have spent most of our childhood learning to filter out rather than paying attention to. So yeah, I agree with you, and I think it's good to point out that the opportunities for this are much greater than just bird monitoring. But we are out of on here after all, so we're talking about the bird part.
And I'll add on to that too. I think this offers opportunities to survey for difficult to survey species, such as marbled murrelet, that, you know, are active at ridiculously early times in the morning in very difficult sites. You could put these devices out in suspected areas, and you know, and have targeted efforts with these moths.
Yeah, I think it might be a little confusing. In Kitsap, our experience with marbled murrelets is silent birds on the water right now, but surely they would have nested here when there were big trees here. And so I think Adrian is addressing the fact that when they're nesting, they are flying in and about the treetops where they nest in the middle of the night, from like midnight to 4 a.m. And so that's what Adrian was getting at. And surely though the murrelets, the few that are, you know, that are left, still they're out and about and trying to find sites. And we're just Kitsap is so central to a possible kind of area where they might be interested in breeding. So heck, we could put during the known prospecting period where murrelets go looking for nesting sites, you know, at night, in the middle of the night, you could put out moths during, I don't know when that is, probably late March, early April, and have them run from 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. and just see if there are any of the characteristic flight calls and wing beat sounds that you get when you actually go to a marbled murrelet nesting spot in the old growth forests along the shorelines in the Pacific Northwest at that time. So it would be a way to see if birds are prospecting for potential nest sites in areas where they aren't breeding yet. And because we're not detecting that any other way at this point, right?
All right, well, we definitely appreciate Adrian, your presentation, and Daniel, for you to provide your input about your work with Adrian and GPC. So thanks everyone for joining tonight, and hope everyone has a happy holiday, and we'll be talking soon.
Thank you everybody for your time. Happy holidays.